What is UX design, or product design for that matter? It still amazes me how much confusion there is today about what different types of designers actually do. Even worse, I know plenty of existing designers who themselves don't quite understand the difference between different types of design. And that's what we're going to cover in today's video, because the reality is there are plenty of differences between graphic design, UI design, UX, and product design. So let's jump in and take a closer look. Now, why should you care about any of this? Maybe you're just an interested third party and curious about the different types of design out there. Or maybe you're an aspiring designer yourself, in which case I have a quick story for you. I was recently talking to a mentee of mine, and she was really interested in breaking into the field of UX. And she thought she actually had a really good CV for that. When we looked at her portfolio together, it actually turned out that she didn't really have any of the essential UX skills required. And she was much more focused on skills that a graphic designer would need to understand. And she was really disappointed when I told her that she would struggle to break into UX with her current skill set. But she was also relieved to finally understand what she actually needed to learn in order to break into the industry. By the end of today's video, you're going to understand what the 4 different types of design are, and you're going to understand the key skills that you would need to develop if you wanted to break into any one of these 4. So let's break this down a little bit more specifically. In today's world, the design umbrella can really be broken into 4 different categories: UX design, product design, UI design, and graphic design. Now, in that order, the design discipline is much more problem-solving heavy at one end of the spectrum and much more creative and making things look beautiful heavy at the other end of the spectrum. Let's work our way across the umbrella and cover each of these types of design in more detail. Starting with UX designers. UX, like you probably know, stands for user experience. And this discipline was essentially created by a guy called Don Norman. If you don't know him, he wrote the book called The Design of Everyday Things. And in that book, he details how there was always too much emphasis placed on how pretty things were and how stylish, and not enough emphasis placed on how they were actually constructed and how they helped users accomplish their goals. And this is exactly the focus of a UX designer, making experiences and products as functional as they possibly can be. UX designers are typically not responsible for making experiences look beautiful. UX is very much a science that follows a regimented process. If you wanted to train to become a UX designer, it would be really important for you to get comfortable with skills like qualitative and quantitative research, doing user interviews, creating things like user flows, and constructing things like information architecture, which really lays out how a website should be organized or how a mobile app should be organized, where the screens go. If the user clicks this link, this is where that takes them. Making all of that make sense is a UX designer's bread and butter. And since we're talking about things like user flows and user journeys, this is a great time to shout out the sponsor of today's video, Miro. Miro make creating things like user flows and diagrams really easy with their new AI functionality. Let's take a little bit of a closer look at how a tool like Miro can help you as a UX designer put these types of flows together. So I'm in Miro now, and let's assume I'm a UX designer trying to redesign a complicated e-commerce checkout flow. One of the things I'll want to do is create a user journey map. This details how my users travel through the existing experience, and ideally, how I would want them to travel through a better future experience. Using Miro's AI feature, I can just provide a prompt like create a user journey for an e-commerce checkout flow, and that gives me a really nice baseline in seconds that I can build off of. We also talked about how UX designers need to build things like information architecture, so how a website or an experience is constructed and organized. I can create this with Miro AI as well by saying, map out the information architecture of an e-commerce website, just like that. And like we can see here, I get a really nice baseline of a sample information architecture for an e-commerce website that I can then go in and tweak. These are just a few examples of how Miro can help a typical UX designer really speed up their workflow and help UX designers get past the terrifying blank page, which, speaking from personal experience, is just never fun to look at. If you're an aspiring UX designer just learning, or if you're an existing one, I would highly recommend you go check out Miro and use their new AI tools. They seriously speed up workflow. It's free to get started, so head over to the website and check it out. And getting back to what a UX designer actually does, we can see that UX design is really all about understanding users and organizing information in a way that makes sense and is ultimately going to lead to tools and products being better at helping users accomplish the things they want to accomplish by using those products in the first place. If you're interested in being a UX designer, I recommend you start championing the mantra of ugly functional experiences will always trump beautiful non-functional experiences. And next, we're going to move on to product designers. Fair warning, product design is a term that is thrown around a lot and really misused in the industry. That's because product designers really are design generalists. They can at any time during their careers be responsible for the entire spectrum of the design process, from being creative and making things look beautiful to being more UX heavy and making things really functional. They could be doing UX research, putting user flows together, wireframing, all the way through to creating a beautiful final UI. And product designers are probably the hardest discipline to get into and be successful at. And that's just because they really require two opposite halves of your brain. They require you to be really analytical and data-driven, and they also require you to be really creative and visually talented. But at the same time, being a product designer is probably the most fun if you're interested in both sides of the design spectrum, because you get to do everything. But because product designers are generalists, you'll primarily see these openings in these roles at startup companies. And startups just don't have the budget to have a UX team and a UI team, and so they really like to hire product designers as design generalists who are responsible for the entire end-to-end design spectrum. Next up, we got UI designers. And now we're moving more into the visual heavy and creative side of the design spectrum. UI design is still somewhat of a science, and we'll get into why in just a second, but it's really more about making experiences look stunning and eye-catching. A UI designer won't worry so much about the architecture of a website or an experience, and instead will worry much more about how an individual page in that experience is constructed and how it looks. Now, I mentioned previously that UI design is still somewhat of a science, and that's because UI design actually uses a visual language, and the letters of that language are called components. An example of a component would be a card or even an input field. And UI designers use these like building blocks to construct beautiful experiences that also make sense. UI design relies heavily on visual design concepts like hierarchy, white space, typography, and balance. If you're trying to become a UI designer, my suggestion would be that you start learning this visual language and how to use these types of components in a beautiful way. You can use a website like mobbin.com that offers a vast library of screens from some of the world's top companies like Instagram, Facebook, Headspace, you name it. You can go into mobbin.com and you can grab some screens that you like, copy and paste them into a design tool, and try to visually deconstruct and then reconstruct them. Our last type of design is graphic design. Visual perfection and creativity are your bread and butter here. While UI designers will work on entire web pages and use things like components to make those web pages beautiful and make sense, graphic designers might work more on individual elements that go on those pages to really make them stand out visually. Graphic design is all about making things pop and look visually appealing, and so graphic designers will probably have to be able to do things like 3D and animation. The tools you'll need to learn as a graphic designer are going to be Photoshop, After Effects, Illustrator, and things like Blender. This is the least scientific of the design disciplines, and while it still relies on design concepts like hierarchy, balance, white space, and color theory, your process is going to differ drastically as a graphic designer depending on how you like to work, how creative you want to be, and how abstract the thing that you're working on needs to be. For example, as a graphic designer, you might be working on a 3D component that's super specific and intended to really communicate what a company does, or you might be working on a promotional video that somewhat communicates what a company does, but is intended to be a little bit more abstract and artistic. It just depends. There's definitely some process to graphic design, like understanding your audience and the context of where your creation is going to end up. But it's just a much more creative and explorative discipline as far as design goes. If you're still not confident that you know exactly what you need to master to become any one of these designers, my suggestion would be to go onto LinkedIn or a job board and look up some job openings for all of these. Make a list of the different skills that they're asking for. It's going to make it much easier for you to understand what you might still be missing to break into any of these fields. You can then start learning tools like Miro if you want to go into UX design, or something like Illustrator and Photoshop if you want to go more into the graphic design direction. As always, let me know if you have any questions about any of these concepts in the comments below. I'll do my best to get to all of them. And best of luck with this, guys. I'll see you very soon.